Okay, well, good evening everybody and welcome to this webinar. Thank you all very much for taking some time out of your busy evening to join us. My name's Amy Burke and I am the Skills Manager at AHDB. So this evening we're going to be talking about succession planning, in particular how to have a conversation with your accountant, and I'm delighted to be joined by a team of experts. We've got Philip Dolbear, who is our Southwest Arable Knowledge Exchange Manager. We've got Paul Harris, who's a Dorset farmer, and we've got Andrew Vickery, who is an accountant. Each of our teams going to be introducing themselves shortly, but firstly, just a little bit of background as to why this webinar has come about. AHDB last year put on some succession workshops across England, and quite a common challenge coming out of those workshops was, this is great and I know I need to go speak to my family, but actually, how do I start the conversation with my advisors? And so what we've planned to do this evening is to ask those questions and kind of dispel those myths of it's not a challenging conversation, and is there any hints and tips from not only the accountant's point of view but also the farmer's point of view with experience and how to make it successful succession. So we've got this webinar and we had nearly 150 registrations tonight, so thank you all again for joining us. You will stay muted throughout the webinar, but if you've got any questions then please pop them into the chat box, and what I'll do is I'll ask the team as they come through and we'll get them answered. Otherwise we'll have a bit of a slot at the end to talk about them, and if there's any that we don't get a chance to respond to this evening, we will follow up with you afterwards. I'd like to thank Luke, who's our digital manager, sat the other end of the country to us, making sure everything works smoothly. So if there are any technical issues, just bear with us and I'm sure they'll get fixed straight away. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Philip, who's going to introduce himself and the team.
Thanks, Amy. Well, good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm Philip Dolbear, the one in the middle there. I've had a career really around farming, and in particular farm business management. Started off with ADAS in farm consultancy, and then 20 years in agricultural banking, but joined HDB 6 years ago now. And although involved on the agronomy side and cereals and arable, a keen interest in the finance part. And this is a theme across the whole of HDB really, because although we spend a lot of time and research looking at practical agronomy, practical livestock husbandry, increasingly we're turning towards the business skills part of farming, as we believe that increasingly farming and farmers need to be agribusinessmen as much as farmers. So I think this subject tonight is a key area in that line, and one which I'm looking forward to sharing with our other two guests. So I will hand on now to Andrew, and he will just tell us a little bit about himself.
Good evening, I'm Andrew Vickery, head of the rural team at Old Mill. My day job, if you like, is dealing with the accounts and tax affairs of a good number of farming clients across the southwest and beyond, but increasingly as part of that work we're also dealing with, if you like, more human challenges of succession planning, which obviously run alongside certain tax and financial aspects, notably inheritance tax.
Thanks, Andrew. And Paul?
Yeah, good evening, Paul Harris. I'm a second generation tenant farmer, predominantly arable. At the moment, I'm the head of our businesses. We have two sides of it, the agricultural side and then also a retail and horticultural side. So I'm head of those businesses at the moment, but my two children have got it greatly in their minds that I should not be the head of those businesses in a short period of time.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think it's important to point out tonight that we're not going to solve everybody's succession issues and accountants issues tonight, and that's certainly not the objective of this webinar, but it is to raise the issues around that subject and to give you some thoughts, ideas of areas to pursue, actions to take to bring the issue of succession, which is often the elephant in the room, out into the open. And the key part of that is the accountancy story, and hence our involvement with Andrew tonight. There are a lot of resources on the AHDB website. and they're there to back that up as well. But this is really perhaps some of the softer skills side of the subject in terms of how to approach it with the professionals and with the family members. So I guess that's a good point for me to kick off and ask Andrew, as an accountant, what would your starting point be, Andrew?
Philip, thanks. I suppose the first question I would ask back to myself is, why are we starting with the accountant in this situation? And the answer is there's no reason why you need to start with the accountant, but we're very lucky still as a profession that annual accounts and tax returns do still give the need for busy farmers, those running businesses, to still see their accountant. And as such, I think we're quite lucky that we do have an ongoing regular relationship with most of our clients, hence the reason, not only that, but of course the link with tax and other longer term matters, that we still have this engagement with our clients. But looking at the slide that's up on the screen, one of the first things I'll say to clients that say we'd like to start thinking about succession or inheritance tax or those sort of longer term matters is, don't necessarily want to sit in a room with a blank piece of paper and incur fees and things like that without having done a little bit of homework. So I always try to set clients a bit of homework, a few things for them to think about in advance, and a few of those points are on the screen. So just looking down through those points, a summary of assets and liabilities, basically who owns what and what is there to think about in terms of succession of the business and the asset base. Amazing the number of times people actually aren't clear. It's perfectly understandable, but aren't clear about what they own, what the liabilities are, and who owns what. Is there a business or partnership shareholder agreement in place? Again, quite often these documents are prepared in good faith at the time, but then sit in the drawer. In a way, that's the best place for some of these agreements to be, because it suggests they're not sort of looked at and argued over on a regular basis. But certainly understanding what provisions of those sort of agreements are and whether they're appropriate or need updating is important. Certainly copies of previous year's accounts and tax returns, more relevant for new clients rather than existing ones, because clearly we would have these, but certainly a useful starting point if you're speaking to a new accountant. Wills and powers of attorney, again, really a lawyer's area, but that is important to understand, particularly for those that don't have wills. Again, very surprising the number of people that still don't have those documents in place, or as per the next point, are they up to date? Are they leaving, you know, assets to people that are no longer appropriate to be left to? And then a final point really relating to inheritance tax: have any gifts of property or assets been made in the last 7 years? Quite often just asking those questions will then get clients' minds thinking as to whether, you know, about some of those longer term matters and what they actually want to happen. So it's quite a good warm up.
Andrew, that's great. It almost sounds too easy, and you know what they say, if it's too good to be true, it usually is. But Paul, you're in the middle of the succession process with your family. How easy do you find in practice to sort of put in some of those points?
Well, it's quite interesting because, as Andrew has said, the one of the professionals you actually, as a farmer, I've always had the longest term of relationships with is the accountant. So Andrew has been doing our accounts for several years now, and every year we discuss succession planning, in as much as we share a percentage of profits, etc., going forward. But when you actually sit down with, you actually make the decision, you're going to go and see Andrew and say, right, we've got to start putting this into practice. We know the wills are there, but they're not up to date. We know who owns what, but we've got to decide what goes where. And when Andrew then comes and gives you the summary of assets listed and wants you to fill in, you suddenly realise, yes, we've got a lot of work to do here. So it is quite an interesting, although we as a family have got basic outlines of where we're going, the actually trying to get the nitty gritty bits right is where it's going to be difficult.
And I mean, so why do people go to the accountant first, which is often the case? I mean, was it your natural protocol?
I think purely because the succession really for us is handing over the assets and the responsibilities. And although we've got very good relationships with our bank manager and our lawyer and our land agent, nobody really understands the financial side like the accountant. And it's the financial side which we've got to set right first, I believe, and then pull the other professions in to advise us and to help us to achieve the end goal.
So Andrew, as Paul sort of mentioned there, there's a lot of people involved in this, but how easy is it for everybody to be acting as a team in your experience?
Well, I think it's quite a rarity to be in Paul's position where there's a regular ongoing relationship with the other professionals. If there were 4 or 5 professionals at play, people might have an active relationship with perhaps 2 or 3 these days. So it's great news if you have got that team in place. I think it's about pulling people in at the right time. And as I say, I'm not particularly an advocate that the accountant sits there for hours at the beginning and deals with things. It's about getting clients to think about for themselves, to start with what they want, try and give enough steering and direction to get that thought process going, and then give input, particularly where it's paid for, input at the right times.
Yeah. Paul, farmers often talk about the yields they've got in the pub, but I doubt whether successions talk very much, but do you share it with any of your farming colleagues and principals?
I think that when I was facing succession 30 years ago from my father, I certainly talked peer to peer with my fellow young farming friends, and we were all discussing how badly we were being treated in our succession, and I'm sure the same is happening now. But also, those same people which I was discussing things with 30 or 40 years ago, yes, we're talking about how we're going to hand things over, or who's going to be taking what, because we know each other's, our friends' families. And most of my close friends are actually doing something or planning something. But I do think peer-to-peer discussion is very important. It's sort of almost a way of getting people to think about where they are going. And certainly through my NFU contacts and what I've done a lot of work in NFU in the past, certainly I've sat on various places where I've heard people talking about succession, and it's made me think I've got to do something.
And I guess everybody's got a different idea, and sometimes you come away with a little nugget that actually is applicable to you.
Oh, totally. I mean, wherever you go, you learn something every day. Some things are useful, some things are not. But yes, you say you pick up a little nugget here, or a little idea there, and that's what sort of starts to form the basis of where you're going.
So you mentioned young farmers there, Paul. So when does the process start?
I suppose the succession, the process of succession probably starts in most people's minds once they have another generation to pass it on to, be it a baby. I certainly think that my initial thoughts as soon as my children were born was I need to make sure our wills are updated, and we've got to think about what's going to happen to them if something happens to me. And that view must be carried on and updated all the way through. It's never too early to start discussing.
And Andrew, you would concur with that?
Yeah, I think every situation is different, and I don't think there is a right time for every family to start talking about it. But I think it's almost easier to think, well, when's the wrong time? And that's almost certainly when is too late, or when's it been left too long. And certainly those sort of, situations where you've got the next generation completely frustrated, unable to take any control of the business, not sure where they're going. There's nothing more sad really than seeing that when it happens. And therefore it's the earlier the better, but really at the point at which the potential successors are keen and willing to actually engage with it, even if you're 5 or even 10 years off from actually starting to think about it. The fact is now that farming is much more of a business than it ever has been, and certainly the economic climate will make that even more so. And quite simply, you can't let a farming business just stagnate for a period of time with the 2 generations running rings around one another. There has to be an open dialogue, otherwise the business will not survive and thrive.
Paul, as you said, start early, but you've had marriages in your family. Is there an element of having to start again once some outside blood comes into the family and those situations start taking hold?
Oh, without doubt. My situation really was that I believed that neither of my children would come back into the businesses, and so my initial succession planning was how I was going to make sure that my business asset became my pension, and then left me with something that I could give to the children when they were earning their own businesses. But then all of a sudden, I got two children, having gone to university to read subjects which were away from agriculture, both come back to be wanting to be in the business, and so I've had to change the planning there quite substantially. And now they have both got, one's married with a child, the other one's living with a long-term partner, and there's obviously aspects which that brings in, and it galvanizes my mind to think that actually I need to make sure that they're both set up to go forward so that they can then start bringing their partners and family into their businesses. But I've got to make sure at the same time that my wife and I have got something to live on going forward.
We've got a question come in. Just wondering, were both your children interested in coming into the farm? Has succession always been simple, the children want to come back to the farm, or was there any?
No, neither child showed, well, they both helped on the farm, but my son went off to Reading to read building surveying because he decided that agriculture was a no-hope industry, and he watched us do some barn developments, and he really enjoyed that side. So we went to Reading to read building surveying, but he came out of Reading with a degree in agriculture. So the writing was on the wall. And my daughter went to Cardiff to read biomedical science, and decided she didn't like working in a lab. Did some science-based work within agriculture after leaving university, and then has come back into the retail and horticultural side. So when she heard that I was looking to recruit somebody to work within the office and the financial side, she said, I think that should be me.
Mm.
And so it was quite a sea change really for us. A very, very nice one, don't get me wrong. It's nice to know that the businesses are going to go forward, and I've got great faith in both of them. But they both got their own strengths, and they both got their own weaknesses. But yes, they're driving their businesses forward.
So clearly there's no such thing as a final plan then, Andrew. You'd have plenty of examples where one seemingly set scenario was thrown astray by a change of circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's vital to give the plan time. So there's no point starting to talk about it 12 months before, you know, someone wants to retire, because actually the whole succession process can sometimes throw up a few sort of curve sets, and of course increasingly now we're seeing, you know, perhaps different marriages and different families, and actually walking through things like wills and what's going where, sometimes that can, you know, throw up some humps in the road that people need to work around before they can go forwards with it. But what you can always be sure of is at the end of that process, at least everyone will be much clearer. And it's also surprising how often everyone being clear actually leads to everyone respecting the decisions of those that are passing businesses, farms, whatever on.
So clearly death will be a major driver of succession. Hopefully in advance of that, some planning. What's your experience, Andrew, of some of the key drivers behind succession decisions?
Yes, I mean you're absolutely right. Quite often what starts as a question or a point of concern about particularly inheritance tax actually leads on to a much wider question about succession. So quite often they say, what's the real question? People will be, you know, things like inheritance tax, and increasingly actually things like concerns over long-term care and the costs of that will be the things that bring people to the table, and if you like get them worried enough to think about it and ask the question. But actually the more positive side of it is how can they pass things on, obviously getting sort of inheritance tax savings where appropriate. But actually once people have started to think about you know, some of those points, quite often there are more positive points as well. If there are successors coming into the business or in the business and they're keen to get on, and you've got you know, perhaps you've got those passing on the business, the older generations, you know, start thinking about what a life outside the business could be like. Quite often you've got a push and pull effect whereby everyone, you know, starts to see what the future looks like in a much more positive light. If, you know, again, if that's all done in a rush or
decisions in that 30 to 45 year age group, and I'm very determined that if my children do want to follow on within the businesses, that they should be given the opportunity of doing that. So although there is tax planning to be done, there is also the question of me stepping back, having to allow them to become the lead partner and the lead director in the businesses, and to actually run their own business without too much interference from me in the future once we finish sorting everything. So my big problem then is, what do I do with my time? I'm not a great lover of golf. I've never played, but don't really want to take that up. I'm hoping that the death doesn't come too early. But so it's a question of, but I want my brain to be kept agile and nimble and going forward. So I've got to find myself another role in life, and I'm not sure what that's going to be.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that's really important to your children as well, because a bored dad outside the business is probably as much trouble as an active dad inside the business.
Well, we wait to see.
Time will tell, yes.
We've just got another question come through, and I do believe we had a little issue with sound, so I hope everyone can hear us still fine. And the question is, what if succession involves a new generation or a new entrant vital to the growth of the farm business, but not necessarily a family relative? Do you have any experience of that?
yeah, I think and there's absolutely nothing in anything we're talking about that would preclude it being someone from outside of the family. I mean, certainly you see lots of very good farming businesses where, you know, perhaps those running it haven't got their own children, or they've got children that, you know, aren't interested in coming into the business. There's absolutely no reason why those businesses can't succeed. The plan should be exactly the same. It's one that's starting early. It probably, you know, might rely on a bit more, you know, financial thought. So let's say there are other children who are not going to succeed, and there's someone else in the business who is looking to take the business over, then it's not, you know, necessarily a case of passing things on via inheritance to as great a degree. But there's absolutely no reason that can't happen. We see it very frequently, and actually we're seeing the growth of some very interesting business structures, particularly in the sort of arable and dairy industries, really designed to accommodate that, almost a separation of the land and property assets and the business that sit on top of them, to allow the working assets to, you know, if you like, be succeeded, and the land and property assets to perhaps slightly separately, you know, to perhaps pass down through a bloodline. So yeah, absolutely, you know, very common. But
is it realistic, Andrew, to try and keep things even, or do you have to accept at some stage that there's going to be a differentiation of how the business, some of the activity or some of the value of the business does pass to different members of the succeeding generation?
Well, I'd always draw the distinction for clients between even and fair, and it's very, very difficult in a lot of situations to be completely even, and that might simply be because there's a logical split of the assets, but it's not quite 50-50. But I think getting a fair split of the assets, and there are lots of ways of achieving that, but I think most people tend to know what that looks like when they see it. But quite often fair is what the, you know, what the generations feel is a fair way to move forward. As an example, you might have one successor that receives a business that has plenty of land and property, but has debt secured against it. And you might have another member of the family succeeding into a business that actually doesn't have much, you know, land and property, but actually is quite a lot more risky with a greater potential for reward. And you might say, well, actually on a given day, the values might be fair of those two components, but risk and reward of the various, you know, business units being passed on is vital to take into account.
Paul, what's your experiences of trying to keep things fair and even, or even?
I've always believed, and I've always told the children that from a very young age, they would be treated equally, although as a boy and a girl. I've no it's not a question of the fact that my son is taking the farm and my daughter the turf and horticultural side. Is just the way that it's worked out. So it's always to try and be even and fair is going to be the biggest problem we've got going forward. Although we've had very open discussions within the family, and we have basically decided who's going to be doing what and taking what, there will be interaction between the two businesses. Because of what basically the turf business sells the turf that is produced from the farm, which is a very important part of the farm business. So it's a question of who takes where does any profit or loss fall between the turf and the farm or the company, and trying to get that right. We've been working and talking about this now for about 18 months or 2 years, and we still nearly most days come up with a different scenario, which is we need to think forward and think further out. So I'm trying to be as even as I can and try and be as fair as I can, but at the end of the day, I'm hoping when we actually sit down and actually finalize it all, we can all shake hands on it and walk away from it and say, well, that was the best we could do on the day. But I'm hoping it will be fair. If it will be even, I don't know.
I mean, certainly there needs to be compromise from everyone involved, and that's where quite often if the parents in this scenario start an open and honest dialogue early and are honest about the fact that things don't necessarily split perfectly down the middle, but make it clear what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to do, amazing the number of times children will sort of step up to the mark, or successors will step up to the mark and say, yeah, we respect that, thanks very much, we're happy and happy to go forward positively.
Paul, we've shared your situation where there are successors, but Andrew, clearly sometimes there aren't successors in a business. So what's the situation then?
Yeah, but it's a difficult question really, because every situation will be different, and it depends what we're talking about. If it's a business that can be packed up and sold and turned into cash, then essentially we're talking about a will planning exercise and no more than that. But of course most farming businesses would tend to be much more complex than that, and generally there needs to, unless there's going to be a sort of farm sale scenario, there needs to be some sort of succession, even if it's not with natural successors. So is there an interim plan for the business whereby someone comes in and farms the farm on a tenancy or contract farming or some other type of arrangement to succeed the business and keep that running? Often very useful if there's the need to maintain income in retirement from the business, but it doesn't answer the question about any capital assets which need to be passed on. And again, that simply needs a clear plan encapsulating the wills and any other agreements.
Paul, I guess you were in that position before your children decided they did want a change of tact and come back into the business. So you were potentially in that no successor scenario.
I mean, yeah, that was totally. To a degree, we've had a sort of a 180 degree in our planning for where we're going forward. But we've known now for 8 or 10 years that all of most of them would come back into the business, and so we've been able to turn that round. And my daughter, which I've always thought she would go and earn a wage somewhere else, but just sort of take an interest in the business, having to come back in 2 or 3 years ago, has made a slight change in there. But they're both doing very well, taking that forward. But definitely, Philip, we were working towards how can we make sure there's an income stream for us going, my wife and myself, going forward, so that we could sort of take our foot off the pedal and retire, but still have an income stream and still plan to have something to hand over. But it's as Andrew said, every situation is different, and to be honest with you, every week and every month changes where we go and what's going to happen after tomorrow.
Or after into March. We've got another question come through. So what are the implications of gifting for CGT as an owner-occupier with 2 sons in the business and 1 not?
I suppose that's going to be a question for the accountant, isn't it?
Yeah.
So CGT,
Well, certainly not for me.
CGT capital gains tax, being the tax that normally applies if you dispose of capital assets or make gifts of capital assets, and it's a very important question, and inevitably with any succession plan, it's vital to get the sort of human aspects nailed down as far as possible, and then there is quite often for the accountant and the lawyer a sort of technical session that follows to basically see if the plain English plan works. And one of the key points with that is if we're talking about gifting away assets as part of a succession plan, does that give any issues in terms of capital gains tax, which would generally apply to any gifts made, even if there's no money received? It's quite a critical point. A lot of people say, well, no money changed hands, how can there be tax? Yes, you can absolutely pay tax if you make a gift to a connected party and don't claim the relevant reliefs. By and large, so within agriculture, and this is a very broad statement, but within agriculture, there are lots of very helpful reliefs. Holdover relief in particular would generally allow a capital gain on a business asset to be what we call held over to the person that receives it. So if you're talking about genuine business assets used in a farming trade, they can generally be given away without any capital gains tax issues. However, there are lots of exceptions to that. A notable exception would be, say you've got let property on the farm, ex-farm workers' cottages, things like that. They won't generally have the same reliefs, and therefore a bit more careful planning is needed there.
Okay, it still sounds quite complicated. How many types of tax are involved, or is there just too many to even begin to? What would you advise clients to do, to go and speak to their own accountant, or is there some light research they can do before?
No, I think the homework that I referred to at the beginning has to extend really to the human bits. There's actually nothing worse than going through this sort of exercise, and rather than, you know, the clients focusing on you know, where they want assets to go to or how the practical changes will work, they sort of dabble a bit in understanding a bit about capital gains tax or holdover relief or inheritance tax relief. That should be the domain really of the advisor. But the key is that if they've got a good understanding of what the client or the family wants to achieve, then they should be able to then overlay and more particularly identify any potential tax issues that might come. There are 6 or 7 key taxes in play, and each one could be a potential issue, but there are normally ways of navigating around, again, particularly if you've got business assets with plenty of reliefs available.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Andrew, and I've seen lots of situations myself where really the families and the members involved just need to sit around and communicate and work out what they want, what they don't want, what they value, what they don't value, and what their motives are for the future. And until the family members have sorted that out, really you're pushing at a shut door, in my opinion. You just pick up on something else you said about involving the lawyer, and we did talk about that before, but at what point do we get the solicitor involved here? I mean, is he very much the last piece of he or she the last point of the jigsaw puzzle, just to rubber stamp in legal jargon everything that's been decided, or should it be earlier?
No, absolutely not. And I think I would say this process could absolutely begin with the solicitor as much as it could begin with the accountant. There'll be lots of people that have far better relationships with their solicitors than with their accountants. It sort of depends who gets there first. It probably doesn't need everyone to start the conversation. But if, you know, as soon as there is an outline plan, and particularly once the accountant in my situation starts putting the technical detail on things, I think as soon as there's an outline, if you like, plain English plan, that ought to be shared with the other relevant professionals that are going to have some input, because they can start then, even if it's just thinking about things, they can start to sort of mull it over in their own minds and be up to speed. So when they are called upon for evaluation or you know, start, you know, talking about executing legal documents and things like that, they've had plenty of lead up to it.
Has that been your experience, Paul?
Oh, totally. The most important thing is to get to understand. My family's been quite simple because we talked forever about where we were going to go. I think it's much more complicated where you've got several several parts of the farm. The farm is run by 2 or 3 brothers, sisters, and then there is succession going down for children at either side of that. So you've got cousins that are going to be inheriting. I think that's far more difficult. But the most important thing is you can find out what everybody wants out of the job to start with, and then it's very important to get. And as Andrew said, it's very important to get this. Make sure that you've got a solicitor who you know that understands where you're coming from or what you've been doing in the last few years. It's very important that you've got a valuer that you trust, or everybody within the family can trust. But at the end of the day, it will be the accountant that's going to have to sort of sort the big bills out at the end of the day. And so, you know, it's getting the team together.
Okay, in relation to that, we've got a good question come through. Any thoughts on 2 brothers, succession in dairy farm, when both families want to farm, any arrangements, do you have to split in the end? So 2 generations on one business. Any thoughts?
I think that's you again, Andrew.
Just to be clear, is that 2 brothers or 2 generations?
2 brothers, and it says both families want to farm.
So it depends how well the cousins and the in-laws all get on.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the best thing that happened to me was being a sole trader, or at least being partners with my wife. But I know several families where they've gone on exceptionally well. And don't get me wrong, my brother and I get on very well, but we've done far better because we've got different opposing views on quite a few things. And we get on well because we're apart. I suspect at the end of the day, unless you're going to make it become some very large corporate business where people can have shareholdings, at the end of the day, but until the family can sit down and say what they want, the most important thing to do is to get all of the family around the table and say, what do we all want?
I've seen lots of situations where you've got very forward-thinking parents, typically, who have got one eye on perhaps the 2 children needing to split, but also one eye on the fact that actually keeping everything together in the short term might be the best thing, be that efficiency, economies of scale, or whatever else, but always having that eye on what might happen in the future. So not necessarily setting it up so it's unsplittable or, you know, incredibly expensive to do that. It's difficult to say it's anything other than hedging bets. But of course, it gives that, as people start to come through and succeed in the business, it gives people a chance to work out, you know, what their skills are. So having 2 children in their early 20s and sort of saying, oh, they'll definitely want to split or they won't. There's a lot of life that they have to live before that actually becomes a real decision. You know, you might get married, they might have children, they might have spouses that do or don't sort of get on with things. They might take to different areas of the business, but you can't preordain everything. In a way, people have got to earn their, you know, people have got to have their say, the successors, and work out, you know, where they want to go with the business.
Yeah, my experience would be that often the sort of direct blood relatives can still farm together. It's when the marriages and partners come along that change the dynamics a bit. So it really is, as you said, Paul, down to people and communication, and you know, there's no blueprint for that, and there's no silver bullet either. It is just a question of being able to talk and be honest with each other.
And you can get the situation where 2 brothers may be of a similar age and therefore a similar physical ability and what have you. But if it then goes down to the next generation, the cousins may not be the same age. There may be a 10, 15, 20-year age gap between cousins. And that's when it becomes more difficult because, you know, if one cousin's been involved with the business for 15 years before the second cousin comes into the business, then, you know, it all becomes very, very complicated.
And they might not inherit the same skill sets as their parents, and that can change things dramatically as well.
So quite timely with us discussing talk between your family and everyone talking. We've got this great question come through. My parents are tomorrow meeting with the lawyers and accountants with the view to be bringing me into the business as a partner. Where do I start, as it's not been discussed with me at all?
It's a very timely question, and I think the key probably to go into the meeting tomorrow is to go in with a very open mind and, you know, be prepared to ask plenty of questions. There's no reason why it would, but it's sort of the opposite of my sort of doing a bit of homework in advance and thinking about it. I think, you know, the key going into that meeting for the person asking the question would be to understand exactly what the implications of becoming a partner are. What does that mean, good and bad? It's hopefully not just to save a bit of income tax. Hopefully it is part of a wider succession planning plan, and there may be a wider plan, but I think it's got to be a stepping stone to a wider plan rather than you know, just a sort of set piece, particularly just around income tax, which is quite often the driver for bringing in extra partners.
I guess the first thing is this person's got to get invited to the same meeting that his parents are at with the professionals. But they say a good solicitor never asks a question that he can't answer himself, and I guess that might be a question to ask here. Is so when this individual is asked, well, what do you want? Then you've got to be actually clear. If you're going to put your hand up and say, you know, I want to be involved in this, have worked out actually what you want, your role in the business, your risk you're prepared to take in it, and hence the reward you're looking to get out of it.
I agree with you there, Philip. My first question would be, do you want to become a partner? And then I would say, don't look at this meeting being totally negative. It may well be that your parents have actually realised that succession planning needs to happen, and they now want to go and talk to some advisors to see what the options are that to them are, and how it impinges on them and their business they built up, without knowing a lot more about your business. So, but the most important thing probably is the fact that they are thinking about succession, so that they are making the first steps. It may be that they're making them rather in a one-sided way because they haven't talked to you, but perhaps they want to know where they stand before they actually have a conversation with you.
Yeah, and I think my advice would be, you know, to use a cliche, don't bite off the hand that feeds you, and sort of don't back yourself into a corner, and keep flexibility and be open-minded about anything that's on the table or could be on the table.
It sounds like, Paul, that you have a really good relationship with your children. You're very open and honest with the conversations. Has anybody had any experience where maybe the parents can't talk to the children, or the children can't talk to the parents? And in that scenario, what solution is there? How do you begin to have a conversation?
I would say there are a good number of businesses, clients of ours, lots of other people who would find succession absolutely impossible, either because that's talking about feelings longer term, and of course it does bring in very emotive subjects such as, you know, people thinking about their own deaths and things, and there's undoubtedly a right time to do that, particularly on the inheritance tax side, before it gets too real. If people, you know, if you're talking to a generation that's going to a funeral once a week, I'm afraid it all seems rather too real if people are in their, you know, late 70s, 80s, 90s. But I'm afraid to say those businesses that don't face up to it, I suspect, I've got no statistics to back this up, but would stand a much reduced chance of being able to have the business continue. So it's something that either people are very good with and will proactively deal with themselves, or they realise they need some help to facilitate that to happen. But anyone that just sticks head in the sand, doesn't deal with it at all, has a real problem, because quite simply it doesn't deal with itself.
Yeah, I think trying to find the arbitrator is key to that, and I guess that could be a number of people. It could be professional, it could be another family member, or it could be a very good and respected friend in the area.
Yeah, and I think we're talking a lot about paid for professionals, accountants, solicitors, you know, everything else, but the problem or the thing that's not exploited enough to my mind is the use of peers and you know, friends and neighbours. Quite often there's a confidentiality concern there, but I think there's a lot of very good, perhaps someone's been through the same process 5 or 10 years earlier and looks like they've, made a success of it. It doesn't always have to be paid for.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of things. I mentioned the AHDB website where there's a lot of tools, but we're sort of just starting to draw towards an end now, and I don't think there's any immediate questions. Would you just like to summarise some of the key messages that you think we've been through so far? Andrew, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate that point just made, you can't make people do succession, but you can create an environment where it happens. So, those running businesses looking to hand things over have got to be open-minded enough to actually start the question. It cannot be, trying to start the question with a closed book. So it's all about the environment and encouraging people just to think about things as a starting point.
I suppose in reality, nobody wants to think too much about their death, and to a degree, we're lucky that none of us know when it's going to be. But if you are the younger generation and you're wanting to succeed, then I think there is a certain amount of emphasis on you to actually very gently start the conversation about what am I going to be doing in the future, which parts of this business am I going to be having, and I think also that if you're the senior generation and you're not sure if your successor in title is in your vote up to it, because they're not ready for it yet, then I think you need to think, actually, when will they be ready for it? I think we've gone away from the days of people not being able to sign a check until they're in their 50s, because nowadays with modern banking, it's probably the 20-year-olds that can do it. But I do think if you are the senior generation, you just do need to say, well, is it better to let somebody make a mistake while you're there to oversee, or to be there for them to come and ask you and say, how do I get myself out of this hole? Or is it better for them to make a mistake when you're 6 foot under?
I would just sort of add to that. I made the point earlier about, getting people thinking about, their asset bases and what they want and wills and things like that. But of course, that focuses very much on the senior generation. There's absolutely no reason, if it's going to be a, more of a joined up family discussion, that a series of similar questions couldn't be posed to, the younger generation. In fact, they absolutely should do as part of the process. What do they want from the business? What do they want to do? Where do they want to live? What's the opinion of the, of the spouse and the children of the next generation? They've all got to be involved in the conversation. But if everyone gets out on the table what they want to achieve from it, it generally tends to get a better result, or a clearer result.
A common theme that seems to be coming through to me, and actually this applies not just to communication, it's everyday running of a business, but it is about communication, it is about compromise, because very rarely can absolutely everybody be happy and achieve all of their objectives. Sometimes it's got to be a bit of give and take. I'm going to ask perhaps now a slightly controversial question. In the presence of our accountant, Andrew, and he's a lot bigger than I am, so I hope he'll be kind, but maybe I'll talk. Do you think you can do this process without an accountant?
You certainly could do the process without an accountant, because at the end of the day, if you're the senior generation and you want to plan who is going to take on after you and how you're going to split it if there's more than one child, then yes, you can do that. You can make all those decisions yourself. And if you're an exceptionally switched on business person and you understand all the ramifications of tax, and if you're very switched on legally and you understand all the ramifications of wills and death duties and everything else, and if you're very switched on within the value of all your assets and you can value all those and split them up, you don't need any professionals. But if you're that sort of person, I very much doubt you're going to be wanting to hand over. So I think at the end of the day, unless you are so good that you don't need professionals, unless I cannot understand how anybody would attempt to do it without having a professional input on several sides.
Well, I tend to agree with you, Paul. These guys haven't spent 5 years training for nothing,
No.
and they probably know something that you haven't become aware of in your day-to-day business.
I think all I would say to that is that the accountants certainly, not everyone will have that relationship with their account to deal with the human bits. At the very bare minimum, the accountant's going to need to provide some input on the tax and financial points, but actually the human bits could be just as easily done with a farm consultant. It's someone that you've got a trusted relationship with ultimately.
Super. All right. Well, that's some good key messages there. I really appreciate it. So thank you very, very much for that discussion. We've got quite a few questions coming through now. So just before I go into those, just to remind everybody who has signed up this evening, this presentation has been recorded and it will be available on our AHDB YouTube channel, along with the other webinars that relate to succession. So there might be some other topics that relate more towards planning succession with your family, whereas today is specifically talking about the accountant role. Okay, so the first question that we've got coming through is, any extra thoughts or tips on how to manage a situation where some children or siblings, i.e. cousins, want to farm and other children do not? So it's that multi-generational thing we've discussed previously. Any tips on how to manage that?
Well, it's increasingly common and no less difficult as a result, and the thing that makes it definitely more challenging has been the substantial increase in capital values for owner occupiers or those that own land and property, because quite simply anything which tries to tie a non-farming member of the family to a farming asset for old time's sake, i.e., yes, you can inherit a sixth interest on which your brother or cousin's got a tenancy and can farm for the rest of their life, it is by most stretches pretty unfair unless there is some longer term plan like a bit of development land or something else. Very, very challenging. So ways to solve it: be honest about the fact that it's challenging. Don't try and pretend that quite often it's female non-successors are going to be happy with a bit of an interest in a block of land. Get it sorted out. Engage with the succeeding members of the family to work out how they would solve it. Quite often it could be done via perhaps a life policy or being paid out early, but they can have as much role in solving that conundrum for the good of their non-farming sibling or cousin or whatever else. But engage early and face into the problem.
So Andrew, there's a lot of businesses that have been very successful by really concentrating all their resources, borrowing, profits and everything else, time and management into a one enterprise business and a very narrow focus in that respect. But are you advocating there the value of not having all your eggs in one basket in terms of longer term succession planning?
I think it's always very helpful if there are, say, on-farm and off-farm assets, because if there are non-farming successors, then that's quite an easy way of dealing with that. But that is again the advantage of starting to plan a bit early. But that's a real advantage of starting to think, as Paul said earlier, when children are born who might or might not succeed. Paul's lucky he's got 2 successors, but if he didn't, would there be a plan B where there was enough on off-farm value? That is great if there is. But you're right, farming is very capital intensive. A lot of people have ploughed everything into it, but again, it's engaging with the successors to work out how that's solved. And again, it might not be equal. It might just be getting a fair situation. Is it unfair if the farming successor takes on the farm and the debts? Well, it might be that and an overage arrangement or something. So if they choose to sell the farm, then a bit more goes back to the non-farmer. But it might be that the person that doesn't succeed, but actually just receives a lump sum payment or some cottages or something that are let out, perhaps You know, they've got the easier deal in some ways. It certainly might be an arrangement that suits everyone, even if on paper the asset values are very different.
Certainly, I've heard of a situation recently where the non-farming succession looks upon the value of the property as the asset, but the farming, the one that wants to carry on farming, says, well, it's my workplace, and holds a different value on it completely. And therefore, that's where you really got to start talking. And the siblings need to sort out, and the cousins, whatever generations it is, need to be sitting around the table and saying, what do we want? There's no point somebody working forever and to find they ended up with nothing because it's going to be split.
It goes back to those questions you talked about at the start. So maybe the young generation needs questions such as, what do you want? You know, just as much as, you know, when you do succeed over the farm, what do you want to do equally? We've just got a couple more questions, and then I'm going to wrap up. We have got, can you elaborate more on holdover relief for CGT, capital gains tax? If you can answer that as short or as long.
Again, I thought for whose benefit? Yes, I can, but I'm not sure how much everyone will enjoy it. No, so capital gains tax, again, is the tax that arises if a gift or a disposal of a capital asset is made. So we're really talking here about, let's say, it's a block of land that parents want to give to a succeeding successor in the business. With no planning, if that gift was made, even if no money is received for that, there would be capital gains tax arising. However, in most situations like that, if there's no money coming into the system, people wouldn't want to pay the tax, and the way they would generally get around that is using what they call holdover relief, which allows the gain that would otherwise have arisen to be deferred until that land is then subsequently sold by the person that's receiving it. So it's only deferring the tax liability, but it might never arise because that person might just hold on to the land indefinitely. So it's not storing up a problem, and it's by far and away the most common relief used in that scenario.
Thank you. The next question is, what happens if a succession plan has been agreed, but then a parent changes it in their will at a later date?
That will remain for many people a risk with the whole process. So even when a plan is agreed, unless to the extent things aren't executed fully, and that might be giving away the assets so the ownership changes, in which case the deal is done. But unfortunately, there are, in the absence of really nailing things down like that, which might or might not be the right thing to do, there is always the risk that things could change. So unfortunately, these things will always rely on a strong element of good faith by all parties, as they should do.
And that's maybe where the solicitor will come into play.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, the last question which relates to that is, do you think the successors and the people involved in the succession plan should have their own independent advice?
I think it's always nicer if you can have advisors that straddle both generations, because quite often these situations will not be super formal, and actually making them very formal quite often makes the whole situation rather different. You know, we're talking about quite often the older generation giving over substantial amounts of wealth, and the minute that, you know, Philip used the phrase earlier, sort of biting the hand that feeds. I think if it can all be done in good faith and good spirit, quite often with joint advisors, that's fine. If that isn't the case and you take a more formal term, then I think, you know, people might need independent advice. But we're generally talking about businesses that will have a transition period where everyone farms together, take a farm partnership. It's not that normal for, you know, one generation to step out and the other one step in. And to the extent there's going to be a joint period, then hopefully everyone can work together and be on the same page. I wouldn't rule it out for some situations.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. We're going to stop now to run out of time. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who has registered and has been listening in. We've had a really good turnout, some great questions. There will be more webinars coming up, so ensure you have a look out on the events page of the AHDB website. Thank you very much, Philip, Andrew and Paul, for taking time out. Be a busy evening. As I said, the webinar's been recorded and will be live on our website. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.